So today we're looking at sort of domestic policies, domestic changes, domestic issues throughout the 1970s, and some of this directly related to Nixon and sort of Nixon's programs, his policies, his way of handling things. Some of them not necessarily related to Nixon himself, just some changes and phenomena and movements that just happened to be going on throughout the 1970s. And several of these things are actually continuations, of things that had been building and brewing and developing since the 1960s. It's not like things just automatically get, cut off and started over and renewed and so forth as we enter a new decade. So we talk a lot about how the 1960s was a time of great social change, of great awakening in social issues, whether it was civil rights, but then and also economic inequality and things like that. But how that continued to find resonance in different groups of people as African Americans began to push for greater social equality, economic equality, political equality. Those ideals, as well as their tactics of nonviolence and confronting injustice and exposing injustice and getting the federal government on their side to correct those injustices. Those ideas, inspired people of other walks of life and in other, schools of thought to do similar things. We hit on that a little bit with the growth of the women's movement, of other kinds of minority rights movements, whether it was Native Americans or Hispanic Americans. So we're going to continue to see a little bit of that today. We also see actually beginning in the 1960s and then finding further terminus in the 1970s is the environmental movement. So this is one, keep in mind, it did not get started all of a sudden out of nowhere in the 1970s. It actually got its traction and sort of found its voice originally in the 1960s. And if you remember, we actually mentioned some environmental concerns and some environmental programs, some environmental ideology that was worked into the Great Society. There started to be, great concern. This had been kind of a growing thing really for decades of concern about the damage that was being done to the environment with rapid growth, with the move to suburbia, that more and more areas, natural areas, were being threatened, that more resources were being overutilized, that all of the massive industrialization and economic expansion that had taken place after World War II, or really even before that was damaging the environment. And we kind of mentioned that a little bit with the Great Society. And so later in the 1960s, we start to see that find further and further definitions and a further voice about those growing concerns. And a particular event, in this case, a book, actually, a publication of a book, that really kind of sparked a more modern, or what we kind of sometimes would call the modern environmental movement, was a book published in 1962 by a lady named Rachel Carson. She published a book called The Silent Spring. And The Silent Spring, she was specifically drawing attention to the use of harmful pesticides. The use of pesticides that were used, in really large amounts, big, large farms where they would use big machines or even airplanes to dust and to spray crops with these, industrial pesticides to kill insects and, prevent disease and stuff in crops. But what she found, and what a lot of, scientists had confirmed, is that there were some really harmful side effects to other wildlife. Particularly in this case, what she was talking about in this specific book was that the pesticides softened like the shells on birds' eggs, so that the baby birds inside couldn't survive and they would die. So that the use of these pesticides to grow crops was killing off, just hundreds, thousands, who knows how many, of birds. That's the name of her book, Silent Spring. What do you think she meant by that? Yeah, if we don't do something about this, if we're not careful about what we're putting into the environment, all these birds are they won't be there, they'll be extinct, and we'll have a silent spring. There won't be any birds singing in the springtime. And while her book was specific, more specific to that particular pesticide and that particular instance, it overall was just bringing more and more attention to the fact that some of the things that we are doing are damaging the environment, and harming plant life, harming animals. And if we don't do something about it, then these things are no longer going to exist. That we have to be better stewards of our world. We have to be more conscious. It's not just about preserving natural resources so that places look nice, but we've got to try to reverse the damage that's been done. We've got to do things and enact policies that are going to not only prevent it from happening more, but to try to fix what already has been done. So that gives that environmental movement more support and gives it more of a unified voice and a unified kind of platform for which to work for more things. And then, of course, it continues, and all different, environmental movement involves lots of different things, whether you're talking about deforestation, whether you're talking about harmful chemicals into the environment, you're talking about water pollution, air pollution, all kinds of different areas where different groups of people were advocating for, more protection of the environment, more responsibility on individuals, more responsibility on businesses, on corporations, to do their part and make sure that they were not polluting, or that they were at least making efforts to avoid it or efforts to clean it up. So there are lots of results of this. We're not listing every single one of them, but one example of a way the government eventually responds to this and starts taking part in that responsibility for the environment is the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. You may have heard that called in the 1970s, which is, the part of the government, part of the federal government office of your bureaucratic agency, an agency of the federal government which oversees environmental regulations. So there's lots of environmental regulations that come out of this movement that we're not listing here. You need to make sure you read about them. But things like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, laws that say, there are restrictions on the kinds of chemicals that can be put into the atmosphere, on the kinds of chemicals that can be dumped into the water, restrictions on those, or requirements that businesses, if they are putting stuff in the air, they've got to have what they call scrubbers on their smokestacks that remove filtration systems to remove a lot of that stuff before they put it in the air. Water treatment plants on site, things like that. That if they chop down so many trees to build a new factory or to make whatever it is, they got to plant so many different requirements that they're putting things back into the environment as well. Then you also get things like the Endangered Species Act, which protects species that have gotten below certain numbers so that they can't be hunted, and to provide other kinds of protection to try to rehabilitate those endangered species and overall just protect the environment. So while this does, even now these kind of things are still controversial as to how much they should be done and how effective they are. But overall, there is a lot of progress made in cleaning up water and cleaning up the air quality does improve, particularly in a lot of larger cities, and just kind of changes the mindset a bit and kind of creates more of a mindset that, there is a responsibility amongst people, growing social consciousness. And I think, of course, we continue seeing that grow even now, probably even more so now than there was in the 1970s, a social consciousness about the environment and about the human impact on the environment and the kind of things that we put into the environment and being good, responsible stewards of that. So again, that's not something that, it's not like it's part of, I don't want you to think of it as like part of Nixon's agenda or something. It's really not, but something that, or a way that the government is continuing to respond and change and react to some of the demands of the time. We also want to talk about the continuing women's movement. Now, this is again where we're picking up from where we left off before. We know that feminism organized and became a force to be reckoned with in the 1960s. Many women inspired by, like we were saying earlier, some of the same ideas and tactics that inspired African Americans to seek greater rights, create that wave of feminism throughout the 1960s after the feminine mystique and this sort of, awakening among women for greater equality, access to higher education, access to jobs, equal pay, and all that kind of stuff. Well, that, of course, continues into the 1970s. It's not like all of a sudden that just stops. That's still going on. And you still have lots of groups still seeking better access, better opportunities, greater political equality, social equality, and economic equality with men. But we also start to see the women's movement, just like how we saw the African American civil rights movement start to fragment and start to splinter as time went on, and you started to get those divisions between, the nonviolent ideal and then the more militant wave. You get the same kind of thing happening in the women's movement. It also starts to splinter and kind of go off in some different directions, which ultimately cause some concern and may also cause it to stall a little bit. One of those divisions that we start to see into the 1970s is a rift growing between what might be called liberal feminism versus what some people like to call radical feminism. And that word radical feminism, it's arguable that some people in that category might not even like the word radical all that much, but sort of a different view of what exactly the goals of the women's movement should be, what exactly they were trying to change and how they were trying to change it. The earlier, phase of feminism would probably be categorized more as the liberal feminists, those that wanted, laws to protect women in the workplace, political equality, legal equality, women having the same kind of legal rights as men, access to health care, all those kinds of things that we talked about before, access to jobs, access to education, no barring of women from certain professions, no barring of women from certain colleges and all of that. But then you have kind of a more extreme view of things, a more extreme wing that kind of starts to split off from that as we move into the 1970s of more what some people call radical feminists. Radical feminism is more about the culture, is almost, it differs, this is a spectrum thing, but some radical feminists would argue for just complete no distinction at all between gender, just completely getting rid of any kind of gender distinction. It's that for a good way to look at it is a radical feminism is more attacking the culture. It's not so much about the law, it's not so much about policy that's discriminating against women. That's the problem. It's a cultural thing. It's a cultural objectification of women, a culture that encourages or does nothing, looks the other way when it comes to violence against women, when it comes to rape, all those sorts of things. That is more radical feminism. Interestingly enough, it's the kind of things that honestly, the past couple of decades have become more mainstream. That's the stuff that in the 1970s would have been part of the radical thing, that attacking a culture that people would claim is demeaning to women, oppresses women, objectifies women. That's the kind of thing people seem to be more talking about now. It's not so much about the legal thing. The legal barriers are oftentimes removed. It's the culture itself that they're kind of attacking. So that gets attacked also then when it kind of goes up in this radical direction for some of them. Some people attack that. That's way too much. We don't need any of that. That is excessive. There are, while we might agree with political equality and there ought to be legal equality, but there are differences between men and women, and we shouldn't be getting rid of that, all that kind of thing. So that actually creates this sort of anti-feminism movement as well. So you get this splinter within the movement between this more liberal feminism, wanting greater equality, and a more radical idea of kind of wanting to eliminate gender biases in general, whether they're warranted or not. And then that creates this whole backlash against the whole thing. And anti-feminism, at first it kind of makes it sound, you think, oh, that's people that just don't want women to have any kind of rights. Not exactly. Anti-feminism is these people, a lot of them women. Anti-feminism groups, some of the loudest voices were women, just like, the National Organization of Women and Betty Friedan and all of that. One of the most prominent faces of this anti-feminist movement, this lady right here, her name is Phyllis Schlafly, a group called the Eagle Forum, which kind of emerges as an opposition to now. But the anti-feminists would argue that all of this undermines traditional values, that it undermines women's traditional roles, that women, have a specific job in maintaining the family and, raising strong families and being that kind of stabilizing force. And that if you start going down this road of women not having any kind of difference from men and all this sort of stuff, then families are going to be falling apart, and it's just the whole moral fabric of America will fall apart. You know, the country's just going to break down into chaos and immorality and all this kind of stuff, and that women kind of had a special place and that needed to be preserved. Some of this also comes from more conservative religious ideology, because a big, part of the liberal feminist movement, a big part of the women's movement was access to birth control, access to abortion, and those are, of course, things that the evangelical movement, which is growing at this time, was extremely opposed to. And so it continues to oppose what it sees as a very radical, very dangerous, very unhealthy movement taking place in the women's movement. So women's rights, of course, it's not like it stops. Of course, we see now, of course, it continues even now. But it does kind of lose I don't want to say loses momentum as in it comes to a stop, but just like with the African American civil rights movement, it does kind of start to splinter a bit and differ, and there's disagreement within the movement of exactly what they ought to be doing, as well as there's backlash against the movement itself. That ERA amendment we talked about the other week, the Equal Rights Amendment, Congress passes it, but it's defeated by the states. That never becomes part of the Constitution, still isn't. And it was defeated largely by those anti-feminists, by women like Phyllis Schlafly that I showed you just a second ago. She was one of the ones leading the charge against that, to say this will harm women. This will mean that women would have to sign up for the draft. This would mean that women wouldn't have access to child support payments. It would mean all kinds of things to harm women's rights rather than help them. So that never does pass. So women's movement, of course, continues. A struggle still going on for many. And now we want to look at some of the things that are specifically related to Nixon and some of the problems the country was experiencing, how he tries to deal with them. And in domestic policy, Nixon is far less successful. His real achievements are in the way of the foreign policy stuff with détente, with the new approach to China and all of that. That's really where he was kind of able to shine. Domestically, he's not really going to have a great deal of success. There were a lot of problems that were, for one thing, unprecedented, things that really had never happened before, so people really didn't know how to handle it. And also, Nixon, a Republican, is dealing with the Democratic Congress, and so he's unable to get a lot of things through. They're at odds there, so he's sort of still an age of divided government. But before we look at some of those problems, we're going to talk about sort of a political shift that's taking place and that Nixon is taking advantage of. This is one of the ways that Nixon gets elected. And we've actually already hit on this a little bit before. This is the wave, this is the change that's already happening, and Nixon is starting to capitalize on this more. Nixon and the Republicans call this the Southern strategy. Now, if you think back, way back, historically, the South, up until this point, since Civil War and all of that, what political party did the South typically favor? The Democrats, okay? Democrats had, the Democrats called the South the Solid South. Ever since the days, think about election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln. He wasn't even on the ballot in southern states. You could not get elected if you were a Republican in southern states. That was unheard of. Democrats didn't have to campaign or worry too much about the South. It was the Solid South. Because the South had traditionally been very conservative, very religious, patriotic, and staunchly anti-communist, suspicious of any kind of welfare programs, of any kind of federal programs, intervention, all this kind of stuff. And those were things that the Democratic Party had typically not favored. But times are changing. Think back, civil rights has changed that. The Great Society has changed that. Those have become things that the Democrats are now more in favor of federal programs and all that sort of thing. So that has changed. Furthermore, the South has changed. The South looks a lot different by the 1970s than it did in the 1940s, 1950s, and earlier. The South has grown a lot by that point. There was a lot of migration to the South, to southern states in World War II. That continued throughout the 1950s, throughout the 1960s. More and more people moving to the South. It actually grows at a much faster rate than other parts of the country. A lot of businesses moving to the South, relocating their businesses and factories even to the South in those decades. There were a lot of things about the South that were quite attractive to a lot of individuals: warm weather, low taxes, cost of living is low, kind of things that still attract people to the South. That kind of thing still is kind of a trend, particularly amongst retired people, things like that. And so it brings more business, it brings more economic growth. The South, in other words, by the 1970s, is not this, sparsely populated, really poor, part of the country that it once was. Population has increased. Education has increased. The economy has grown. It's a much more politically relevant part of the country than it ever had been before. And, the ideology, of course, had changed as well. So that means, there's more votes to be had here. There's more congressional representation in the South by this point because the population has grown. That means more representatives. That means more electoral votes. That means all of that kind of stuff. And because of the changes in demographics, because of the changes in political parties, this was becoming a part of the country that opposed high taxes, opposed social welfare programs on the whole, opposed civil rights activism, and therefore a lot of white Southerners start to feel very, very alienated and disconnected from the Democratic Party, that had once had such a stronghold in the South that you didn't dare show your face if you weren't, a Democrat. There's that phrase of Southerners being, some people call them yellow dog Democrats, meaning they'd rather vote for either they would vote for a yellow dog if it was a Democrat, or they wouldn't vote for the other way around. Anyway, but just the whole idea that there was no other political pattern, there was no other voting pattern for white Southerners. But that is starting to change. We saw that first with Goldwater, in 1964 with Goldwater, the Republican, was taking some, it really even started earlier than that, but started to have some success in Southern states with this much more conservative message, anti-big government kind of message. But this kind of thing is what Nixon and the Republicans really seized upon. They took advantage of that and said, we're going to focus our attention on the South, something that Republicans would not have bothered doing, before this. There was no point in that. You weren't going to, you didn't want to show your face in the South prior to that. But they saw the potential. They saw that change that was taking place, and that the Republican Party, with its message of low taxes, smaller government, we're not going to be enforcing a lot of extreme civil rights legislation, no busing, we're not going to be going after all that stuff. That really strikes a chord with a lot of white Southerners. And so we're starting to see this major realignment happening. It really had already been happening, at which Republicans call all of this the Southern strategy, that we focus on the South, but we put, more attention on the South and getting their support, because that's relevant now and that's possible now, and that there's a lot of value to that now when there wasn't before. And so that transition is starting to happen, and, it really has been going on for a while. It really gets solid by 1980. But by this point, and as we see now, the South is red. It's the other way around. It reverses completely. And that is what that change that was beginning to happen is what Nixon and Republicans were seizing on with this Southern strategy. So it's not just their plan. It's also important to understand what was changing there, that the demographics were changing. Civil rights had changed things, the economy had changed things, and just completely shifted political affiliation in the South, political priorities in the South, and political power in the South, from the South being solidly Democrat to the exact opposite, where today it is solid Republican. Now, as far as Nixon's sort of domestic agenda, he doesn't have like a fancy, little program with a cute little name attached to it and all that kind of business. Part of his overall concept that he is proposing is something he calls a new federalism. Now, federalism, remember, that's a general word going back to 10th grade. That refers to that division between federal government, state government, national government, state government. New federalism was Nixon's plan, conservative Republicans' plan to return more power, as they said it, to the states, to decentralize a lot of authority. So this is how, particularly this is their approach to things like a lot of Great Society programs, a lot of social welfare programs, is to say we're not going to necessarily get rid of that stuff. They do get rid of some of it. But we are going to turn control over those things to the states, that the federal government is not going to administer food stamps directly. We're not going to administer, low-income housing payments directly or any of that kind of stuff. We're going to hand that over to the states and let the states deal with it. And that is the way that almost all social welfare is done today. It's actually administered by the states. The federal government gives grants, what are called block grants. You'll learn about those in government next year. Gives block grants to the states, and then the states figure out what to do with it. And they're the ones that make the call about how food stamps get administered, what the requirements are, how much people get, all those kind of benefits, things like that is actually done by the state level. So it was taking a lot of that away from the federal government, handing that over to the states, which Nixon argued was more efficient. That meant, he argued this means that the states actually get more money and that it's less interference from the federal government. You're handing those things over to the states that know better what their people need, that know better what the situation is in their particular state and can better handle those monies and make sure that they get spent the right way. But it is also, is in line with that Republican concept of trying to get rid of a lot of, a federal bureaucracy, of a lot of excesses they would see at the federal level and not have as much responsibility at the federal level. So that's their concept of new federalism. Whether or not that works or doesn't work, complete, matter of opinion. You've got lots of different information that would point either way. You got people that think this was a good thing, people that think it was a bad thing. There's kind of a little bit of both in all of it. So a lot of it just depends on people's particular political ideology. Now, where Nixon kind of has some of the biggest domestic problems at home prior to the Watergate scandal, of course, is the economy. Now, the economy of the United States, ever since World War II, how would you overall describe the United States' economy? It's been prosperous, it's been booming, it's been growing, everything's been great. We've seen this massive economic expansion that has been, unprecedented since World War II ended, or really since the United States got into it. Well, that starts coming to a halt by the 1970s, or at least it starts to slow down. So what we start to see in the 1970s is economic, as it says here, malaise. Malaise means, like when you just don't feel well, you're just kind of like that, you just don't want to do anything. That's malaise, just not really going anywhere. It's not exactly a depression. It's kind of a recession, but I mentioned before that word recession can get a little weird. Economists don't really like that word because it doesn't have a technical definition. But the economy is simply not like it was. There are a lot of economic problems the country hasn't had to deal with in a couple of decades. The economy seems to be slowing. Things are slowing down, and a lot of economic problems are starting to become very much an issue. In the 1970s, there's something going on that becomes called stagflation. The economy is stagnant. What does that mean if something is stagnant? Staying still, not growing, it's not really going anywhere. The stagflation, where do you think the inflation part comes from? Inflation. So what we have here is the economy is shrinking, the economy is not growing, and we have rapid inflation, a massive inflation problem in the 1970s. What does that mean is happening if there's inflation? What's happening to prices? Prices are going up. So every time people go into the grocery store, bread and milk and all the things that they buy, the prices are higher and higher and higher. But that's happening when the economy is not doing well and the economy is shrinking, and usually those two things don't happen together. Usually it's the other way around. Inflation typically happens when the economy is growing at a rapid speed. That's when prices start going up. Usually when recessions take place, when there is shrinkage of the economy, or at least slow growth, inflation either stays steady or inflation actually declines. Prices start to fall as people are experiencing unemployment. So this was a rather unusual combination of things to happen, and one of the reasons why the government struggles to deal with it, because this had never really happened before. It was very confusing and seemed to defy, the rules and the understanding of economics, to have the economy shrinking and inflation's growing out of control as well. But you have, and there's several reasons why the economy was not doing well, why you had inflation and GDP, that's gross domestic product. That's one of the measures of economic health that we use. It was falling for the first time since World War II. But, a lot of this had to do with Vietnam. There had been tons and tons of spending to support Vietnam, and yet taxes were not increased to make up for that. So there's these big deficits that have caused things to slow down. Also, you have to realize that after World War II, the United States really didn't have too much of a rival or really any big competitors in the world as far as industry and, manufacturing, because the rest of Europe was still reeling from World War II. And so the United States was kind of, supplying most of the world's manufactured goods. Well, by the 1970s, that's no longer the case. The United States faces significant competition from Europe, from China, from other parts of the world. And so the United States just is not as dominant as it once was by the 1970s. Those baby boomers that we talked about, they're all entering the workforce by the 1970s, or a lot of them are entering the workforce by the 1970s. So you got more people going into the workforce than there are jobs, which means unemployment. So unemployment is going up, but prices are going up, and people don't have enough jobs to pay for things. So it's just it's a rough time, and things are just staying still or shrinking, and inflation, again, growing out of control. Mentioned unemployment. So unemployment is happening because, again, companies are having to cut back because they're not, doing as well. They're facing competition from other parts of the world, more people seeking employment because of the baby boom. That economic dominance just isn't there anymore. So Nixon wants to, deal with this, and, the general trend is whatever wrong with the economy, we tend to look to the federal government to want to fix it. But again, a lot of these problems were unusual and different, and people didn't really know exactly what to do. Furthermore, Nixon, he wants to do something, but doesn't want to take over too much control because that doesn't agree with his political ideology that, the federal government needs to have a whole lot of control over this kind of stuff. So he's struggling to find a balance between doing something and, not doing too much or risking doing too much. And then what makes things even worse, probably considered one of the biggest parts of this economic distress of the 1920s, is in 1973, we have the oil crisis. 1973 oil crisis, or the OPEC embargo. So OPEC, I mentioned once before, I believe, chapter 37 is where it was. OPEC, that stands for, you don't necessarily have to know this, but just so you know, if that makes any sense. That stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It is basically a cartel. It's a group of countries, mostly Middle Eastern, Saudi Arabia, places like that, that export oil. And it also includes Venezuela. That's the only one that's not a Middle Eastern Arab country. They formed this cartel in the 1950s, as a means of controlling oil prices. What they do is, they control the supply of oil and therefore control the price of oil. Well, in 1973, they put an embargo on the United States on oil. What does that mean? They're not selling it anymore, at least the Arab nations. It included actually just the Arab nations of OPEC. Put an embargo on the United States regarding oil, basically saying to the United States, we are not selling you any oil, you are cut off. Now this had to do with, part of the reason why, had to do with the United States' support of Israel, which we have not talked about. Unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about everything, so look over that. The United States had, since, Israel's creation at the end of World War II, continues to have a policy of Israel, right or wrong. Well, that rubbed a lot of Arab nations the wrong way. And so when the United States got involved or encouraged a conflict involving Israel, OPEC's retaliation against the United States was to place an embargo on oil. So what does this mean for oil in the United States? Prices will go up. What happens to supply? Very, very low. Huge shortages of oil throughout 1973, throughout this oil crisis. As you can see here, this guy, perhaps an owner or a manager or an employee of a filling station, say we don't have any gas, and that was common amongst a lot of gas stations. A lot of them go under because they don't have anything to sell. You can see here at the bottom, look at all the cars lined up, everybody trying to get gas. You may have parents or grandparents that might remember some of this. Ask some of them. They might tell you that maybe some people told me you get up early in the morning on Saturday and go get in line at the gas station, try to get gas. There was talk about rationing it. The federal government does not actually do that. Some local governments might have attempted to do things like that to try to get people by, but gas prices were going way, way up, and not enough. There just simply wasn't enough to go around, so some people were having to find other means of transportation. This is where we eventually start to get, more of a consciousness about oil dependency, and then more of a move toward alternative energy sources and things like that. The oil embargo is eventually lifted. It's lifted at some point in 1974 when the United States gets out of that conflict or withdraws their support and things like that. But it definitely exposed that dependence on oil, and it certainly didn't help any of the other economic problems of the era of the 1970s. Now, how Nixon tries to deal with some of the other stuff, the big problem again is inflation. That's the big thing that they're trying to deal with, is the inflation problem. Is that you have prices going up and up and up and up, and people's wages just aren't going up with it, not going up to meet that. So Nixon attempted price freezes, price freezes. And these were meant to be temporary. It was a 90-day thing, 90-day price freezes, which would mean what would happen with prices? They have to stay. It's basically ordering prices to stay at a certain level for 90 days. This was also true for wages. So 90 days of freezing prices so they can't go up, trying to just sort of let things even out and calm down. Well, it doesn't work. Doesn't work at all. The price freezes actually weren't even on everything. The prices were on some things, but not on everything. And so it just caused really a lot of problems. A lot of, for example, like farmers had to, kill livestock off because they couldn't sell them because of price freezes, but nobody was buying them, so they just had to get rid of them. So it did not help the problem at all. And eventually had to be lifted. In fact, they didn't even make it their full 90 days before Nixon had to make them voluntary, sort of encourage businesses to voluntarily use these price freezes, but of course people aren't going to do that. So the inflation problem continues and continued to be an issue throughout the 1970s, and we will see Nixon's successors even deal with the inflation problem. So that continued to be an issue and something that they never couldn't get a handle on, at least at that time. They tried different things as well as the price freezes. They tried, more spending, less spending, raising interest rates, but none of that really worked to fix any of those problems. So kind of a bad time for the economy for sure. And that oil crisis, again, really exposing that dependency on oil and how problematic that really could be. Now, again, Nixon's greatest achievements, certainly not in the domestic realm. And then even all those things, of course, are going to be overshadowed by the thing that ultimately brings Nixon down, and that, of course, is the Watergate scandal. So that's what you will look at tomorrow when I video it, and then we'll go from there. So questions on any of that?